The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Judge Margaret Thornfield walked through the hallways like she owned the entire building. Her expensive black shoes clicked loudly on the floor with each step. Everyone who saw her coming quickly moved out of her way. Some nodded respectfully, others just looked down at their feet. Nobody wanted to get on Judge Thornfield's bad side. Margaret had been a judge for 15 long years. She was 53 years old, with silver hair that was always perfectly styled. Her black judge robes were custom-made and cost more than most people earned in a month. She wore expensive jewelry and carried herself like a queen. In her mind, she was the most important person in the courthouse, maybe even the most important person in the entire city. As she entered her courtroom, Margaret looked around with satisfaction. The room was exactly how she liked it, clean, organized, and quiet. Her wooden bench sat high above everyone else, making her feel powerful. The American flag stood proudly in the corner, and the state seal hung on the wall behind her chair. This was her kingdom, and she was the ruler. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Thornfield," called out the bailiff, a middle-aged man named Tom who had worked with her for 10 years. Everyone in the courtroom stood up immediately. Margaret loved this moment. She loved the power, the respect, and the fear in people's eyes. She sat down slowly, enjoying the silence. Her assistant placed a stack of case files on her desk. Margaret looked at the first file and frowned. Traffic violations. She hated these small cases. They were beneath her. She thought she deserved bigger, more important cases. But the city assigned her whatever cases they wanted, and she had to deal with them. "Call the first case," she said in a cold voice. "Marcus Williams, case number 2024-4567, traffic violation," announced the court clerk. Marcus Williams stood up from his seat in the back of the courtroom. He was 28 years old, tall and thin, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. He had been working construction for 5 years, building houses and office buildings around the city. Marcus was a good man who worked hard and took care of his elderly mother. He had never been in trouble with the law before. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had gotten a traffic ticket for running a red light. He wasn't trying to break the law. He had been rushing to get to work because his boss had called him for an emergency job. The traffic light had just turned red when he went through the intersection. A police officer saw him and gave him a ticket. Marcus had planned to pay the fine right away. It was $200, which was a lot of money for him, but he was willing to pay it. However, the next day, the construction company where he worked had to lay off several workers. Marcus was one of them. Suddenly, he had no job and no money coming in. He couldn't pay the ticket on time. Now, 3 weeks later, Marcus had found a new job. He had saved up enough money to pay the fine, plus the late fees. He had even bought a new suit for his court appearance. It was the first time in his life he had owned a suit. He wanted to make a good impression on the judge and show that he was a responsible person. As Marcus walked toward the front of the courtroom, he felt nervous. His hands were shaking slightly, and his mouth felt dry. He had never been in a courtroom before. The place felt cold and unfriendly. But he kept telling himself that everything would be okay. He would explain what happened, pay his fine, and go home. Judge Thornfield looked up from her papers as Marcus approached. The moment she saw him, her expression changed. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed together in a thin line. She had already made up her mind about Marcus before he even opened his mouth. "Another one," she said quietly but loud enough for everyone to hear. The court reporter typed her words into the official record. Judge Thornfield often made these kinds of comments, especially when young black men appeared in her courtroom. She thought she was being clever, but really she was just being cruel. Marcus heard her comment and felt his heart sink. He tried to stay positive and focused on why he was there. He had his checkbook ready to pay the fine, and he had prepared a short explanation about what had happened. "I suppose you have some sad story about why you couldn't pay a simple fine on time, Mr. Williams?" Judge Thornfield asked in a mocking tone. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, looking down at Marcus like he was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. Marcus cleared his throat and tried to speak respectfully. "Your Honor, I apologize for not paying the fine on time. I was laid off from my construction job for 3 weeks and I didn't have the money. But I have a new job now, and I'm ready to pay the full amount today, including all the late fees." "Save it," Judge Thornfield interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "I've heard every excuse in the book. You people always have the same stories. No job, no money, no responsibility. Do you think I was born yesterday?" The courtroom became very quiet. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. Marcus felt his face get hot with embarrassment and anger. He couldn't believe a judge was speaking to him this way. He had come to court ready to take responsibility and pay his fine, but she was treating him like a criminal. Sarah Chen, a young lawyer who was watching the proceedings, immediately stood up. She wasn't representing Marcus, but she was in the courtroom for another case. She couldn't stay silent after hearing Judge Thornfield's inappropriate comments. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't think that comment was appropriate for a courtroom," Sarah said firmly. She was only 30 years old, but she had been practicing law for 6 years. She had seen Judge Thornfield's behavior before, and she was tired of staying quiet about it. Judge Thornfield's face turned red with anger. How dare this young lawyer challenge her authority in her own courtroom? She slammed her hand on the desk, making everyone in the room jump. "Sit down." "Counselor!" Judge Thornfield shouted. "I'll decide what's appropriate in my courtroom. I am the judge here, not you. If you don't like how I run things, you can leave." Sarah sat down slowly, but she didn't take her eyes off the judge. She pulled out her phone and started typing notes about what she had just witnessed. She had been documenting Judge Thornfield's behavior for months, and this was just more evidence of her bias and unprofessional conduct. Marcus stood there feeling helpless. He had come to court to resolve a simple traffic ticket, but now he was being humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. He wondered if this was how the justice system really worked. Was this how judges were supposed to treat people? Judge Thornfield looked back at Marcus with contempt. She was about to deliver what everyone expected would be a harsh sentence. She was known for being especially tough on people who couldn't pay their fines on time. She was preparing to make an example out of Marcus to show everyone in her courtroom that she was in charge. But as she opened her mouth to speak, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors suddenly burst open with a loud bang. Everyone turned to see who was entering the courtroom so dramatically. What they saw would change everything that was about to happen. The stage was set for a moment that would turn Judge Thornfield's world upside down, just as she was about to destroy Marcus Williams' day. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to change forever, and that justice was about to be served in a way that nobody could have predicted. The courtroom doors flew open with such force that they hit the walls with a loud bang. Everyone in the room jumped and turned to see what was happening. Judge Thornfield stopped talking and looked up with annoyance. She hated when people interrupted her courtroom. 3 people in dark suits walked quickly down the center aisle. They moved with purpose and confidence. The person in front was a woman with short brown hair and serious eyes. Behind her were 2 men, both tall and strong-looking. They all wore badges on their belts and had the kind of presence that made everyone nervous. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Thornfield demanded, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "This is a court of law, not a playground. You cannot just barge in here during proceedings." The woman in front reached the judge's bench and looked up at Judge Thornfield with cold, professional eyes. She pulled out a leather wallet and opened it to show her badge and identification. "Judge Margaret Thornfield," the woman said in a clear, strong voice that everyone in the courtroom could hear. "I am Special Agent Rebecca Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These are Agents Johnson and Rodriguez." Judge Thornfield's face went pale. The FBI? Why would federal agents be in her courtroom? She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands started to shake slightly. She gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. "I don't understand," Judge Thornfield said, her voice now much quieter than before. "What do you want?" "I'm in the middle of conducting court business." Agent Martinez reached into her jacket and pulled out an official-looking document. The paper had government seals and signatures all over it. She held it up so Judge Thornfield could see it clearly. "Margaret Thornfield, you are under arrest for federal crimes including corruption, accepting bribes, civil rights violations, and abuse of power under color of law, Agent Martinez announced. Her words rang through the courtroom like a bell. Silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the court reporter stopped typing and stared with her mouth open. Judge Thornfield, the woman who had been acting like a queen just moments before, now looked like she had seen a ghost. "This is impossible," Judge Thornfield whispered, then her voice got louder. "This is ridiculous. I am a sitting judge. You can't just come in here and arrest me. I have immunity. I have rights." "Actually, ma'am, we can," Agent Martinez replied calmly. "Federal judges don't have immunity from federal criminal charges, and we have been investigating you for 8 months. We have enough evidence to prove that you have been breaking the law." Marcus Williams stood frozen in place, watching everything unfold. Just minutes ago, this judge had been making fun of him and treating him terribly. Now she was the one in trouble. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It felt like a dream. "Agent." Johnson stepped forward with handcuffs. Judge Thornfield saw them and took a step back, bumping into her chair. Wait, she said, panic clear in her voice. "There must be some mistake. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just doing my job. I sentence people according to the law." "The evidence says otherwise," Agent Martinez replied. She nodded to Agent Johnson, who moved closer to the judge's bench. "We have recordings of you accepting money from lawyers in exchange for lighter sentences for their clients. We have bank records showing unexplained deposits in your accounts. We have documented cases of you treating defendants differently based on their race." Sarah Chen, the lawyer who had stood up to Judge Thornfield earlier, was now recording everything on her phone. She had been waiting for this moment for months. She had been the one who first reported Judge Thornfield's suspicious behavior to the authorities. "You need to come with us now," Agent Rodriguez said, as he moved to block the exit behind the judge's bench. There would be no escape for Judge Thornfield. The judge looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for someone to help her, but everyone just stared back at her in shock. The bailiff, Tom, who had worked with her for 10 years, didn't move to help her. The court clerk looked down at her papers. Even the cleaning lady in the back of the room had stopped working to watch. "I want to call my lawyer," Judge Thornfield said, her voice now shaking. "I have the right to call my lawyer." "You will have that opportunity," Agent Martinez said. "But first, you need to come with us." Agent Johnson approached the bench, with the handcuffs. Judge Thornfield backed away until she couldn't go any further. Her expensive robe suddenly seemed like a costume, and her perfect hair was starting to come undone. "Please," she begged. "Don't do this here. There are people watching. This will ruin my reputation." "Your reputation was ruined the moment you decided to take bribes and treat people unfairly because of their skin color," Agent Martinez said firmly. "Now please turn around and put your hands behind your back." Judge Thornfield had no choice. She slowly turned around, and Agent Johnson placed the handcuffs on her wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut seemed to echo forever in the quiet courtroom. As the agents prepared to lead her away, Judge Thornfield looked out at the courtroom one last time. Her eyes met Marcus Williams's eyes. The young man she had just been mocking was now watching her get arrested. The shame and embarrassment on her face were clear for everyone to see. "Margaret Thornfield," Agent Martinez said as she began to read from a card, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The Miranda rights that Judge Thornfield had heard read hundreds of times in her courtroom were now being read to her. She was no longer the one in power. She was now the defendant. "Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Agent Martinez asked. Judge Thornfield nodded weakly. She couldn't speak. The reality of what was happening was finally sinking in. The 3 agents began to escort Judge Thornfield out of the courtroom. She walked slowly, her head down, no longer the confident woman who had entered that morning. People in the hallway stopped to stare as they saw the famous judge being led away in handcuffs. Marcus Williams watched until she disappeared through the doors. He still couldn't believe what had just happened. One minute he was being treated like a criminal, and the next minute the judge was the one being arrested. Sarah Chen approached Marcus with a big smile on her face. "Sir, I think your case is going to be dismissed," she said. "And this arrest is going to help a lot of people who were treated unfairly by that judge." As news of the arrest spread through the courthouse, more and more people gathered in the hallways. Word traveled fast that the infamous Judge Thornfield had finally been caught. Her reign of terror was over, and justice was finally being served. The courtroom that had been filled with fear and tension just minutes before was now buzzing with excitement and relief. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. The corrupt judge who had made so many people suffer was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Marcus Williams walked out of the courthouse that day a free man, knowing that he had played a part in exposing corruption and making the justice system a little bit fairer for everyone. After the FBI agents led Judge Thornfield away in handcuffs, the courthouse exploded with activity. People were talking loudly in the hallways. Court workers were whispering to each other. Lawyers were making phone calls. Everyone wanted to know what had just happened and why the famous judge had been arrested. Agent Martinez stayed behind to talk to the people who had witnessed the arrest. She needed to collect statements and evidence from everyone who had been in the courtroom. The investigation was far from over, and every piece of information was important. Marcus Williams sat in the hallway, still trying to understand what he had just seen. A court officer approached him with a kind smile. "Mr. Williams, I'm Officer Janet Mills. I work with the court administration. I want you to know that your traffic ticket case is being dismissed immediately. You don't owe any money and this will not appear on your record," she said. Marcus felt relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I still don't understand. What just happened in there?" Sarah Chen, the lawyer who had stood up to Judge Thornfield, sat down next to Marcus. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Mr. Williams, what you just witnessed was the result of a very long investigation," Sarah explained. "That judge has been breaking the law for years, and today she finally got caught." Sarah told Marcus that she had been watching Judge Thornfield's behavior for over a year. As a defense attorney, she appeared in Thornfield's courtroom regularly. She started to notice strange patterns in how the judge treated different people. "I saw that wealthy people with expensive lawyers got very light sentences," Sarah said. "But poor people, especially Black and Hispanic defendants, got much harsher punishments for the same crimes. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't legal." Sarah had started keeping detailed notes about every case she observed. She wrote down what crimes people were charged with, what sentences they received, and what their lawyers looked like. The pattern became very clear very quickly. For example, she saw a wealthy white businessman who was caught driving drunk get only community service. But she also saw a poor Black man who was caught driving without a license get 6 months in jail. The punishments didn't match the crimes. Sarah also noticed that certain lawyers seemed to have unusual success in Judge Thornfield's courtroom. These lawyers' clients almost always got lighter sentences even when they were guilty of serious crimes. It seemed too good to be true. "I started to suspect that something corrupt was happening," Sarah told Marcus. "So I decided to contact the FBI." 8 months ago, Sarah had called the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. She explained what she had observed and provided all of her notes and documentation. The FBI took her seriously and opened an investigation. Special Agent Martinez had been assigned to lead the case. She was an expert in government corruption and had investigated many crooked politicians and judges before. She knew that building a case against a sitting judge would be very difficult and would require solid evidence. The FBI started by looking at Judge Thornfield's financial records. They got court orders to examine her bank accounts, credit card statements, and tax returns. What they found was very suspicious. Judge Thornfield earned a salary of $185,000 per year as a judge, but her bank records showed that she was spending much more money than she earned. She had made expensive purchases, taken costly vacations, and bought luxury items that she couldn't afford on her salary. The FBI also found several large deposits in her bank accounts that she couldn't explain. These deposits happened around the same times that certain wealthy defendants received surprisingly light sentences in her courtroom. But the FBI needed more than just financial evidence. They needed proof that Judge Thornfield was actually taking bribes and acting corruptly. So they decided to use undercover operations. Agent Rodriguez posed as a wealthy businessman who was facing criminal charges. He approached one of the lawyers who seemed to have unusual success in Judge Thornfield's courtroom. The lawyer, thinking Rodriguez was a real client, explained how the system worked. "If you want a light sentence from Judge Thornfield, it's going to cost you extra," the lawyer had said during a recorded conversation. She expects a contribution for her cooperation. The FBI recorded several conversations like this. They had evidence that Judge Thornfield was actively taking bribes in exchange for favorable sentences. The FBI also installed hidden cameras and microphones in the courthouse. They recorded Judge Thornfield making inappropriate comments about defendants based on their race. They captured her treating people differently depending on how much money they had. One recording showed Judge Thornfield talking to a court clerk about a case. "Another one of those people who thinks they deserve a break," she had said while looking at a file of a Latino defendant. "Give him the maximum sentence. Maybe it will teach him a lesson." Agent Martinez explained to Sarah and Marcus that the investigation had taken months because they needed to be absolutely certain of their evidence. They couldn't afford to make mistakes when arresting a sitting judge. "We documented over 50 cases where Judge Thornfield showed clear bias," Agent Martinez said. "We found evidence of at least 12 different bribery incidents. We have recordings of her making racist comments. We have financial records showing unexplained income." The FBI had also discovered that Judge Thornfield wasn't working alone. Several lawyers were part of the corruption scheme. These lawyers would pay Judge Thornfield bribes and then charge their wealthy clients extra fees to cover the cost. One lawyer, Robert Sterling, had paid Judge Thornfield over $50,000 in bribes over 2 years. In exchange, his clients received sentences that were 60% lighter than the normal punishment for their crimes. Another lawyer, Patricia Wells, had given Judge Thornfield expensive gifts including jewelry, vacations, and even a new car. Her clients almost never went to jail, even when they were guilty of serious crimes. The FBI had arrested these lawyers earlier that morning, before coming to arrest Judge Thornfield. They didn't want to give anyone a chance to destroy evidence or warn the judge about what was happening. This investigation shows how corruption can poison the entire justice system, Agent Martinez told the gathered crowd. "When judges take bribes and treat people unfairly, it hurts everyone's faith in the law." Marcus Williams listened to all of this information with amazement. He realized that he had accidentally walked into the middle of a major criminal investigation. His simple traffic ticket case had become part of a federal corruption case. Sarah Chen felt proud that her decision to report Judge Thornfield had led to this moment. She had risked her career by speaking out against a powerful judge, but she knew it was the right thing to do. "How many people do you think were hurt by her actions?" Marcus asked. Agent Martinez looked sad as she answered. "Based on our investigation, we believe Judge Thornfield unfairly sentenced over 200 people during the past 3 years. Many of them are still in jail serving sentences that were too harsh. We're going to work to fix those injustices." As the day continued, more details about the investigation became public. The news media arrived at the courthouse to report on the shocking arrest. The story of the corrupt judge was spreading across the city and beyond. Judge Thornfield, meanwhile, was sitting in a federal detention center, finally understanding that her days of wielding power over others were over. The investigation had revealed the full extent of her crimes, and now she would face the same justice system she had corrupted for so many years. Within hours of Judge Thornfield's arrest, the news spread like wildfire across the city. Television reporters stood outside the courthouse with their cameras, telling the world about the corrupt judge who had finally been caught. The story was on every news channel, every radio station, and all over social media. Marcus Williams found himself at the center of a media storm he never expected. As he walked out of the courthouse, reporters surrounded him with microphones and cameras. They all wanted to know what it felt like to witness the judge's arrest right after she had treated him so badly. "Mr. Williams, can you tell us what happened in that courtroom?" asked a reporter from Channel 7 News. Marcus felt nervous talking to so many people, but he knew his story was important. "She was making fun of me and saying mean things about black people," he said simply. Then the FBI came in and arrested her. It was like watching karma happen right in front of my eyes. The video of Marcus talking to reporters quickly went viral. On the internet, people shared it thousands of times with comments like "Justice finally served," and "This is what happens when you abuse your power." But Marcus wasn't the only person who wanted to tell their story. As news of Judge Thornfield's arrest spread, dozens of other people came forward. They had all appeared in her courtroom over the years, and they all had similar experiences of unfair treatment. Maria Rodriguez was one of the first people to contact the FBI after the arrest. 3 years ago, she had appeared before Judge Thornfield for a minor shoplifting charge. Maria was a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children. She had stolen baby formula because she couldn't afford to feed her infant son. The judge looked at me like I was garbage," Maria told Agent Martinez. "She said I was a bad mother and gave me 6 months in jail. But the week before, I saw a rich white woman get only community service for stealing expensive jewelry. It wasn't fair." James Thompson also came forward with his story. He was a young black college student who had been caught with a small amount of marijuana. Judge Thornfield had sentenced him to 2 years in prison, which destroyed his chances of finishing his education. "She ruined my life over something that rich kids do all the time without getting in trouble," James said. "I lost my scholarship, dropped out of school, and couldn't find a good job because of my criminal record. All because she decided I deserved harsh punishment, while others got second chances." The FBI set up a special phone line for people who wanted to report their experiences with Judge Thornfield. Within the first day, they received over 100 calls. Within a week, that number had grown to more than $300. Agent Martinez worked day and night reviewing all these cases. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Judge Thornfield had been systematically discriminating against poor people and minorities while showing favoritism to wealthy, well-connected defendants. The FBI's investigation revealed shocking statistics. White defendants in Judge Thornfield's courtroom received sentences that were, on average, 40% lighter than black defendants who committed the same crimes. Wealthy defendants with expensive lawyers got sentences that were 60% lighter than poor defendants with public defenders. Meanwhile, other judges in the courthouse were scrambling to review all of Judge Thornfield's recent cases. Chief Judge Patricia Williams announced that every case from the past 3 years would be examined for signs of bias or corruption. "We cannot allow the actions of one corrupt individual to destroy people's faith in our justice system," Chief Judge Williams said at a press conference. "We will work tirelessly to correct any injustices that occurred in Judge Thornfield's courtroom." The review process began immediately. Teams of lawyers and judges worked around the clock to examine hundreds of cases. They looked at the sentences Judge Thornfield had given and compared them to what other judges typically gave for similar crimes. Within 2 weeks, they had identified 47 cases where people had received unfairly harsh sentences. Many of these people were still in prison, serving time for crimes that should have resulted in much lighter punishments. David Martinez was one of the first people to be released. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for selling small amounts of drugs to support his own addiction. Judge Thornfield had ignored his struggles with addiction and given him the maximum sentence. Other judges typically gave people like David treatment programs instead of long prison terms. When David walked out of prison after serving 2 years of an unfair sentence, his family was waiting for him. His mother cried as she hugged him. "Never thought I would see justice," David said. "I thought that judge could do whatever she wanted to people like me. But the system finally worked the way it's supposed to work." Sarah Chen, the lawyer who had first reported Judge Thornfield's corruption, was also busy during this time. She was contacted by civil rights organizations who wanted to file lawsuits on behalf of people who had been treated unfairly. The NIRACP announced they would be filing a major lawsuit against the city for allowing Judge Thornfield's corruption to continue for so long. They argued that the city should have noticed the patterns of discrimination and stopped her years earlier. "This judge operated with impunity for too long," said NAACP attorney Michael Davis. "The city has a responsibility to ensure that all judges treat people fairly, regardless of their race or economic status. Meanwhile, Judge Thornfield sat in her jail cell, finally understanding what it felt like to be on the other side of the justice system. She had been denied bail because the judge handling her case determined she was a flight risk. The woman, who had denied bail to so many others, was now experiencing the same treatment. Her expensive lawyer, Richard Blackwood, visited her regularly to prepare for her upcoming trial. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and he knew it would be very difficult to defend her. "Margaret, you need to consider a plea deal," Blackwood told her during one visit. "The FBI has recordings, financial records, and dozens of witnesses. Fighting this case could result in a much longer prison sentence." But Judge Thornfield was still too proud to admit her mistakes. "I did nothing wrong," she insisted. "I was just doing my job according to my best judgment." As her trial date approached, more and more evidence came to light. The FBI released some of the recordings they had made, and the public was shocked by what they heard. Judge Thornfield's voice could be heard making racist comments and discussing bribe payments with corrupt lawyers. The 3 lawyers who had been paying her bribes all agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. They provided detailed information about how the corruption scheme worked and how much money had changed hands. Marcus Williams continued to work his construction job, but he also became an advocate for justice reform. He spoke at community meetings and church gatherings, telling people about his experience and encouraging them to speak up when they saw unfairness in the system. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," Marcus would tell audiences. "But when good people stand up and speak out, justice can win. We all have the power to make our system better." The community rallied around the victims of Judge Thornfield's corruption. Fundraising events were organized to help people who had lost jobs or opportunities because of unfair sentences. Scholarship funds were created for students like James Thompson, who had their education interrupted. As part 4 of this incredible story came to an end, the stage was set for the final chapter, Judge Thornfield's trial, where she would finally face the same kind of judgment she had been delivering to others for so many years. 6 months after her dramatic arrest, Margaret Thornfield walked into a federal courtroom as a defendant for the first time in her life. Gone was the expensive black judge's robe that had made her feel so powerful. Instead, she wore a simple, gray suit that her lawyer had chosen for her. Her once perfect silver hair looked dull and unkempt. The woman who had once commanded respect and fear now looked small and defeated. The federal courthouse was packed with people who wanted to see justice finally served. Marcus Williams sat in the front row, wearing the same suit he had bought for his traffic court appearance 6 months earlier. Next to him sat Maria Rodriguez, James Thompson, David Martinez, and dozens of other people who had been hurt by Judge Thornfield's corruption and bias. Sarah Chen, the lawyer whose courage had started this whole investigation, sat with the FBI agents who had built the case. Agent Martinez looked confident as she reviewed her notes one final time. After 8 months of investigation and 6 months of preparation, she was ready to present the evidence that would prove Judge Thornfield's guilt. The judge presiding over the trial was the Honorable Frank Morrison, a 68-year-old federal judge known for his fairness and integrity. Judge Morrison had spent 30 years on the bench without a single scandal or complaint. He was everything that Judge Thornfield should have been, but never was. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," called the bailiff. Everyone in the courtroom stood up. Judge Thornfield rose slowly from the defendant's table, her hands shaking slightly. For the first time in her life, she was the one being judged instead of the one doing the judging. "You may be seated," Judge Morrison said in a kind but firm voice. "We are here today for the trial of Margaret Thornfield, who stands accused of corruption, bribery, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. This is a serious matter that strikes at the heart of our justice system." The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Park, stood up to give her opening statement. She was a young woman, only 35 years old, but she had successfully prosecuted dozens of corruption cases. She looked directly at the jury as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Margaret Thornfield was supposed to be a guardian of justice. Instead, she became a criminal who sold justice to the highest bidder and denied it to those who couldn't pay. Over the next few days, you will hear evidence that will shock you and anger you, but most importantly, it will convince you that this defendant is guilty of every charge against her. Judge Thornfield's lawyer, Richard Blackwood, tried his best to defend his client during his opening statement, but even he seemed to know that the case was hopeless. "My client made mistakes," Blackwood admitted, "but she is not the evil person the prosecution wants you to believe she is. She was a judge for 15 years and she helped many people during that time." The trial lasted 2 weeks and every day brought new evidence of Judge Thornfield's crimes. The FBI played recordings of her accepting bribes from lawyers. They showed financial records proving she had received over $200,000 in illegal payments. They presented statistics showing her clear pattern of racial bias. Marcus Williams was one of the key witnesses. When he was called to testify, he walked to the witness stand with confidence. The nervous young man from 6 months ago had been replaced by someone who understood the importance of speaking truth to power. "Can you tell the jury what happened in Judge Thornfield's courtroom on the day of her arrest?" Prosecutor Park asked. Marcus looked directly at Judge Thornfield as he answered, "She treated me like I was garbage from the moment I walked in. She made comments about you people and acted like I was guilty before I even said anything. She wasn't interested in justice. She just wanted to show everyone how powerful she was." When Marcus finished his testimony, several jurors were wiping tears from their eyes. They could see the pain that Judge Thornfield's actions had caused to an innocent man who had just been trying to pay a traffic ticket. Maria Rodriguez also testified about how Judge Thornfield had sentenced her to 6 months in jail for stealing baby formula while giving a wealthy woman only community service for stealing expensive jewelry. James Thompson told the jury how his unfair sentence had destroyed his chance at getting an education. The most damaging testimony came from the 3 lawyers who had been paying Judge Thornfield bribes. Robert Sterling, Patricia Wells, and Thomas Gray had all agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. She made it very clear that if we wanted good outcomes for our wealthy clients, we needed to pay her, Sterling testified. It wasn't subtle. She would tell us exactly how much money she expected for different types of cases. The FBI agents testified about their investigation and presented all the evidence they had collected. Agent Martinez explained how they had used hidden cameras and microphones to record Judge Thornfield's corrupt activities. Judge Thornfield's defense team tried to argue that she had never intentionally broken the law. They claimed that the gifts and money she received were just tokens of appreciation from grateful lawyers, not bribes for favorable sentences. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury could see the clear connection between the payments Judge Thornfield received and the light sentences she gave to certain defendants. They could hear her making racist comments on the recorded conversations. After 2 weeks of testimony, both sides gave their closing arguments. Prosecutor Park spoke passionately about the importance of holding corrupt judges accountable. "Margaret Thornfield betrayed every principle of justice," Park told the jury. "She sold her position to the highest bidder and denied equal treatment under the law to people based on their race and economic status. If we don't hold her accountable, we are telling every corrupt official in America that they can get away with anything." Defense attorney Blackwood made one last attempt to save his client. "My client is not perfect, but she doesn't deserve to spend the rest of her life in prison. She has already lost everything, her career, her reputation, her freedom. Isn't that punishment enough?" The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman stood up with the verdict in his hand. "On the charge of corruption, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of accepting bribes, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty." Judge Thornfield's face went white as each guilty verdict was read. She gripped the edge of the defendant's table to keep from falling over. For the first time since her arrest, she finally understood that her life as she knew it was over. 3 weeks later, Judge Morrison sentenced Margaret Thornfield to 12 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay back all the money she had illegally received. As the sentence was read, she finally broke down and cried. Marcus Williams left the courthouse that day feeling like justice had truly been served. The young construction worker who had just wanted to pay a traffic ticket had become a symbol of how ordinary people can help expose corruption and make the system better. Sarah Chen was proud that her decision to speak up had led to this moment. She had risked her career to report Judge Thornfield's corruption, but it had been worth it to see justice finally served. As Judge Thornfield was led away to begin her prison sentence, she finally understood what so many of her victims had felt. She was now just another defendant in an orange jumpsuit, facing years of punishment for her crimes. The corrupt judge who had thought she was above the law had learned the hardest lesson of all. In America, no one is above justice when good people have the courage to stand up and demand what is right.